Looking through the directory, Delius began to search for Asa, his oldest friend on this world. And quickly enough, he actually found her, Asa Palot, listed in the directory as actually living quite nearby here. According to the map display that was on screen, Delius could make it there very shortly, without much trouble. Perfect, he thought to himself. I can get in contact with Asa, and she'll tell me what happened. She'll tell me the truth. She might even help me. At least, I hope she will, Delius said as he stared at her picture on the screen. Delius noted from the screen that Asa seemed to live in something called an apartment complex. He noted a room number, as well as the location of the complex on the map, and with that information gained, quickly began to make his way there, trying not to be seen by others and not wanting to move at full speed, as there was a risk that he could accidentally damage the clothing he was wearing, or lose it. It took him about an hour to make his way there, and another 20 minutes to find his way through this apartment complex, which seemed a staggering idea to Delius. Simply houses stacked on top of houses in big blocky segments. Even their homes in the village weren't this close together. He could hardly understand why such a thing would be tolerable. But eventually he found the room that was listed as Asa's room, room 424. As he approached the room, he extended his hand and gave the door a gentle knock, which, of course, sounded a bit more heavy than he intended, to which he eventually heard some shuffling about inside, and what sounded like small metallic objects being knocked over, and rambling in a language that he couldn't understand. But the voice was clear. He remembered it fondly. There was no doubt that it was Asa. However, she did sound very upset, almost belligerent, and he continued to hear the sound of small metal containers being knocked about as they came closer to the door. Eventually, the door itself opening as Asa's face peered out, angrily rambling in a language that he couldn't understand, before looking at him somewhat curiously, and once again muttering something that he couldn't quite understand. Asa herself looked uncharacteristically unkempt. She basically looked a mess, her hair completely out of sorts. She had dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't been sleeping, and far and away from her traditional clothing, seemed to be wearing a somewhat weathered shirt and loose-fitting pants, looking disgruntled and confused all at the same time, as she stared at him. In the moment, Delius simply lowered the scarf wrapped around his head and said warmly with a smile, "Hello, Asa. How are you doing? You must look terrible. Are you ill?" Delius asked as he looked at her, standing there in the doorway, and as he spoke, a look of complete befuddlement and shock came over Asa, as she suddenly seemed to lose consciousness, falling backwards into her apartment. "Well, I didn't expect it to go like this," Delius said, looking at her sprawled out against the floor, surrounded by what looked like alcoholic beverage cans, scattered all over the place. But Delius took a deep breath. "I suppose I'll deal with it. I guess she is sick," Delius said, as he reached down and picked Asa gently up off the floor, walking into the apartment and using his foot to close the door behind him. He walked Asa over to what looked like a comfy sofa, and laid her gently down on it. It looked like she fell pretty hard, so he didn't want to try forcing her awake. Rather, he simply took a seat on the table and waited. After a short time, Asa once again began to stir and move, groggily lifting her head off of the sofa. "Oh," she exclaimed as she held her head, lifting herself back up. It looked like she was still a bit confused in the moment, as she looked over to see Delius, who had taken off his hat and scarf, and was simply sitting on the table in front of the sofa. "Delius?" Asa said, in a somewhat strange accent. "Delius!" she said again, this time sounding much more like the Asa he knew, still looking at him in shock and amazement for a moment. That did not last long, as a moment after that she jumped into his arms, wrapping her arms tightly around him and hugging him. "Oh my God, Delius! Delius, I thought you were dead," Asa said as she finally retracted herself from him, still looking at him in astonishment. "Ow! I mean, they transported you to a world with no atmosphere, no air." "Yes, I know," Delius replied. "It was quite cumbersome. It made things very difficult. However, I am not dead. It simply took me some time to make my way off of the planet." "But how, Delius? Did someone come help you?" No," Delius replied. "I spent the last 2 years on that barren planet. Suffice to say, I almost suffocated. Another year and I most likely would have been dead for sure." "Of course," Asa said, putting her hands on her head. "Your bodies function at the same rate as ours, but you lived on a planet with a slower time frame. So, on your planet, when you held your breath, you were actually holding your breath for years at a time. Oh, why didn't I think of it? It should have been obvious that just transporting you there wouldn't have resulted in your instant death. Now I feel stupid." "Think no such thing, Asa," Delius replied. But Delius, how did you get off? I mean, if no one came and picked you up, then how are you here?" "Well, that's both complicated and exceptionally simple. I jumped." "You jumped?" Asa replied, with a strange look on her face. "Yes, I jumped very, very hard, jumping straight from the planet that they abandoned me on to here. I landed somewhere out in the ocean. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I'd make it. I was very worried about ending up floating in space somewhere. But I landed, so I suppose all's well that ends well," as Asa simply looked at him in astonishment once again. "So you just jumped from one world to another one. You never seem to stop amazing me, Delius," she said, before she suddenly stopped, taking a look around her room, and then at herself. "Oh my God, this place is a mess and I look terrible. I'm so embarrassed," Asa said, beginning to cover her face as she was blushing somewhat. "It's perfectly fine, Asa. People get sick sometimes. It's okay. I mean, it's not something that I've ever experienced, but I hear it's quite tedious to fall ill." In the moment, Asa peeked out a single eye in between her fingers. "Yeah, sick. That's definitely what I've been. I've just been sick." "That explains it all, right?" Asa said, beginning to smile somewhat, as she finally removed her hands, still flushing just a bit. "Asa, there's actually a reason that I came here. I need help. I need to understand what happened. Why did they do that to me? What's been going on?" "Oh," Asa replied, starting to look angry. "Well, that's all very simple. They wanted to get rid of you, Delius. You were too much a danger to their idea, their plans. Don't worry, I'll give you the full scoop, Asa said as she began to look very serious.